It's very much the same kind of rhetoric as we heard from the U.S. government, from the Biden administration when it comes to Ukraine. Your war is our war. We will stand with you until the very end. We're opening up our treasury. We're opening up our wallets and purses. We are opening up our weapons stockpile, and we will feed you everything that you need in order to win this war until the end of time. Same exact posture when it comes to Ukraine as now for this new war in Israel. There's no daylight, said President Biden, nor will there be, between the Israeli position and the American position. And I don't see here in anything Biden said, nor in any of the overwhelming media consensus supporting what President Biden has done, any discussion of whether that will make Americans more safe or less safe, or whether that question even matters. So that is one of the questions I think we need to confront is that a relevant question at all? Does it matter? Even if it's true that Biden's war policy in Israel does not increase American security, or even if it's true that it undermines American security, and I think there's evidence to suggest that it will, as we're about to show you, should the United States just ignore that and support Israel anyway? In other words, should it prioritize the interests of the Israeli government over the safety and security of American citizens if those two are in conflict? It wasn't just Biden's announcement in Israel that tied the United States to this new war, not just in fact, but in the eyes of the entire world, including the Arab and Muslim world, which is increasingly enraged by what they're seeing in Gaza. And they obviously blame not only Israel, but now the United States for that war effort. At the UN today, the United States stood alone in vetoing a resolution offered by Brazil to try and forge a resolution where humanitarian aid reaches the people of Gaza, whose food and water supply are dwindling, who cannot access medication. The lack of fuel is sometimes preventing surgeons from performing life-saving surgery or pulling people out of the rubble because they don't have the energy or the equipment to do so. 1,200 people, according to the New York Times, who are alive but trapped under rubble in Gaza, can't get out, including women and children. And so Brazil offered a resolution designed to ensure the flow of humanitarian aid, and that the United States vetoed it. Here from CNN today, you see the headline: U.S. vetoes Security Council call for humanitarian pause in Israel-Hamas war. Quote, the United States has vetoed a draft resolution at the UN Security Council which called for a humanitarian pause in besieged Gaza, sparking more criticism of political paralysis in the powerful global body. The brief draft resolution proposed by Brazil condemned the October 7th terror attack in Israel by Palestinian militant group Hamas, which killed over 1,400 people in Israel, and urged the release of the hostages taken by Hamas. It also called on all parties to comply with international law and protect civilian lives in Hamas-controlled Gaza amid a ferocious retaliation by Israeli warplanes. The international community should engineer, quote, humanitarian pauses in the fighting to allow for aid delivery, it said. 12 of the council's 15 members approved the draft on Wednesday, with the UK and Russia abstaining, along with the U.S. veto. So had the U.S. not vetoed it, it would have passed because it had an overwhelming majority. The UK abstained because it follows the U.S. Russia abstained because it had offered its own resolution that didn't attract as much support because it failed to condemn Hamas, though it did call for humanitarian aid to enter Israel. Quote, speaking after the vote, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thompson-Greenfield, explained that the U.S. wanted more time to let America on-the-ground diplomacy, quote, play out. The U.S. had previously delayed voting on the resolution. Since the Hamas attack, Israel has been bombarding Hamas-controlled Gaza with airstrikes. It has cut off the enclave's 2 million people from supplies of basic necessities, including food, water, and electricity. More than 3,000 people have died in the Israeli strike, including more than 1,000 children and dozens of aid workers. And UN experts are warning of a widespread disaster if water and electricity are not restored. Now, The Guardian has some additional information on the U.S. veto and how it's perceived. There you see the U.S. veto's UN's call for a humanitarian pause. And we have the video of what happened at the UN resolution. Here is Brazil offering its resolution and the reason why. And then you have the U.S. standing alone and raising its hand to veto it. Watch what happened.
Those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows. 12 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 2 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council.
In other words, the United States vetoed it, and therefore, even though it had overwhelming support, 12 out of 15 members of the UN Security Council voting yes, it could not pass. Brazil offered the resolution. There you see Brazil, they have the presidency of the UN Security Council. And obviously, the U.S. has done this many times before when there's a resolution designed to encourage Israel to reduce the number of civilian deaths or to allow humanitarian aid into Gaza or the West Bank. The U.S. often stands alone in vetoing resolutions to protect Israel, and therefore the U.S. is perceived across the Muslim and Arab world as the main partner that enables this sort of Israeli bombardment. That is an important part of the question of whether or not the U.S. posture will increase the security of the United States and American citizens or undermine it. One of the few times the United States refused to use its veto power to protect Israel was when President Obama, on his way out, after he had signed a record-breaking aid agreement to give $4 billion or close to it to Israel over 10 years, or a $38 billion package over 10 years, so $3.8 billion a year. Now they're about to give much, much more to Israel above and beyond that. In this war effort, President Obama abstained on a resolution that declared Israeli settlements in the West Bank illegal and enabled it, therefore, to pass. But generally, the U.S. uses its security power to protect Israel, causing a lot of animosity, not toward Israel, but to the United States and the Arab and Muslim world. Right now, there are protests, major protests, all throughout the Middle East, the Gulf states, countries with powerful militaries like Iran and Turkey, Lebanon and Hezbollah, not to mention Saudi Arabia and Yemen. You're talking about major protests in Iran as well that are now directed not just at Israel, but the United States. And U.S. support for the war in Israel is going to exacerbate that for obvious reasons. Doesn't mean that the U.S. shouldn't do it. The fact that Muslims and Arabs in various countries are angered by U.S. support isn't proof that the United States is wrong to do it, but it's certainly a relevant factor in the question of whether American security will be undermined rather than promoted by this policy, which seems to be a very important question when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. That should be, in fact, the overarching paramount one, shouldn't it? Now, we have a lot of recent history that sheds a lot of light on this question, that we don't have to rely on speculation as a result, including from the war on terror. Both before the 9/11 attack and after, huge numbers of Arabs and Muslims who tried to bring violence to the United States, or who did bring violence to the United States, in various bombings prior to 9/11, aimed at military installations and American troops in the Middle East, and then 9/11, the first 9/11 attack, the first World Trade Center attack, and then the much more successful one, and then various attempts to detonate bombs in places like Times Square. Over and over and over, the people who did that, this was true as well of the person, Omar Mateen, who carried out the massacre in Orlando at the Pulse nightclub. It was falsely reported that he was there out of anti-gay animus. In reality, he didn't know it was a gay club, the trial proved. He never once mentioned LGBT issues or gay issues when carrying out that massacre. He instead said he was doing it as retaliation for U.S. bombing in Iraq and Syria. And all sorts of people in the post 9/11 era who either did or tried to carry out terrorist attacks in the United States made very clear that their motive was simple. It wasn't that they hated the United States for our freedom. That was the lie that David Frum and Bill Kristol and neocons invented. The fairy tale fed to Americans after 9/11 when they rightly wanted to know, why do people hate us so much that they want to do this kind of violence against us? And the fairy tale that we were told was, oh, it's because they just hate us for our freedom. They hate our democracy. And of course, there are dozens of countries all over the world that are free that they never attacked. One of the things I was recalling earlier this week is, and we're going to talk on Friday night about the insanity that emerged in the United States, the climate that is indescribably unhinged in the wake of 9/11, that flooded American discourse with all kinds of deceit and lies. Obviously, it led to the Iraq War, but one of the things that happened was right in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attack, when Americans were asking this question, why do they hate us? Why would people want to come and do so much violence to the United States? The U.S. government ordered the television networks, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, not to air any interviews with Osama bin Laden. Interviews that he had given in the past or interviews that he would now give to outlets like Al Jazeera. And their excuse was, and this was an indication of how insane the post 9/11 climate was in the United States that I think we have to work very hard to avoid again. The argument they gave was that you cannot show any excerpts of Osama bin Laden interviews because he may, being the very tricky and clever person that he is, use a hand gesture or a facial expression or include a phrase that sleeper cells in the United States have been trained to understand and interpret as a green light for them to go and carry out a terrorist attack in the United States. He was going to, in the interview, rub his nose or play with his ear or offer some kind of phrase. That was the excuse the U.S. government gave to networks as to why they didn't want Osama bin Laden appearing. But the reality was, Americans would then get the real answer to the question, why do they hate us? Osama bin Laden wasn't saying, I want to bring violence to the United States because they have gay bars or women are allowed to walk on the street without burqas or they vote. That wasn't his argument at all. His argument was, I want to bring violence to the United States because they bring violence to our region all the time. One of his examples was the United States imposed a sanctions regime on Iraq that a UN study concluded resulted in the death of 500,000 Iraqi children. And there's the notorious interview with Bill Clinton's Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, where she was asked by 60 Minutes, is it worth it to have imposed a sanctions regime and killed 500,000 Iraqi children? And she said, yes, it was worth it. And that was played all over the Muslim world as proof that the United States had a sociopathic disregard for the lives of Muslim children and Muslims in general. And then he also cited the deployment of U.S. soldiers and U.S. bases on Saudi Arabia, which is considered sacred in Islam. And then also the steadfast support for Israel when it bombs the Palestinians, that the bombs that the Israelis used to bomb the Palestinians come right from the United States. Those were Al-Qaeda's arguments as to why it was justified to target the United States and American citizens, that our active role in bringing violence to the Middle East motivated Al-Qaeda and Muslims to want to bring violence back to the United States. And although it was supposed to be taboo to point this out, I pointed it out many times like people did and got very attacked as somehow offering excuses for those terrorists, even though I always made clear the actions were unjust, but it was still important to understand what motivated them so that maybe we can understand if we were doing things that would undermine the security of the American people. The CIA itself has a term for this called blowback, where they acknowledge that if you go and involve yourself in the affairs of other countries, if you engineer regime change or you bomb other countries or you're perceived as bringing violence, it will blow back to the United States. It will bring violence to the United States, which is one reason, according to the CIA's framework, you don't do that, or at least it's a serious cost to doing it. I want to ask two questions before we get to Brianna Joy Gray, very briefly, of those of you who do support the United States involvement in this war, fully fledged as a participant on Israel's side. Number one, how can it be differentiated? What is the distinction that you can draw between opposing U.S. support for Ukraine in its war against Russia, justified on the ground that Ukraine is an important ally of the United States and we should stand by our allies? How is it possible to oppose that, as many people on the right do, but then vehemently support the Biden administration's similar decision to offer unlimited and unconditional support of all kinds for the Israeli war against the Palestinians? How is that from a MAGA perspective or an America First perspective? How are those different? How does it serve America First to stand by the Israelis as they cut off humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza while the entire Muslim world watches with increasing levels of anger and rage? And then the second question I have is, how does it enhance or increase the security of the American people in the United States to have our government so flamboyantly, so openly, so emphatically rushing to Israel for the president to stand by the side of Benjamin Netanyahu and take Israel's side in every single case, while at the same time we do so at the UN, making clear that Israel's war is our war, and that whatever rage people are feeling toward Israel should also be directed at the United States? How does that increase the security of Americans? Is Hamas a threat to the American people? Doesn't it seem more plausible that by attaching ourselves to the rage being generated, we're ensuring that Americans in the United States, all over the world, are now going to be more vulnerable to attacks and to violent threats as a result of the anger that our interference in this war is producing? I'm genuinely interested in hearing answers to either of those two questions. If people want to provide them in the chat or in the comment section or in the after show that we do tomorrow night on Thursday, I would honestly love to hear it. I've been asking that question for a long time, both questions, and I've yet to hear an answer. But whatever else is true, whatever your views are on this war, I hope we can agree that it is urgent we allow open debate of those questions in the United States, that when our country involves itself in a new war, it's not only tolerable, but urgent and necessary for everybody, but especially journalists, to be able to ask those questions I just asked and to be critical of the United States if they want to be. And that no interests are served by suppressing dissent and demonizing it and getting people fired for asking those questions. I hope that is a value around which we can unify. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.